Welcome to the Healthy Relationships Initiative podcast. Our goal is to provide information and tools to help you build happier, healthier, and safer relationships of all kinds. To learn more about HRI, please visit www.guilfordhri.org and check us out on social media at GuilfordHRI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Healthy Relationships Initiative Relationships Booster. The Healthy Relationships Initiative is a partnership between UNC Greensboro and the Phillips Foundation, and our mission is to promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds in Guilford County. A few little housekeeping details before we get started. So first of all, in the chat room, we encourage you to remain anonymous by picking a username. And also, we do encourage you to use the chat room. We'll be able to take questions throughout the program today, and the best way to do that is to use the chat room and direct it to our moderator, Camilla. And toward the end of the program, we'll be asking for feedback, and before you sign off today, we hope that you'll take a couple quick minutes and fill out the form, and the link to that will be posted in the chat room before we wrap things up. The topic for today's Relationship Booster is getting your team to talk to you. And my name is Christine Murray, and I'm a professor in the Counseling and Educational Development Department at UNC Greensboro, and I'm also the director of the Healthy Relationships Initiative. And today for our program, we are joined by Brenda Stubbs, and she's a health educator and the Triad Regional Coordinator for the March of Dimes North Carolina Preconception Health Campaign. Thanks so much, Brenda, for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you and learning from you on this topic. So before we jump into the topic, could you share a little bit about your background and why you were interested in being part of today's program?
Sure. Well, I've been working in health and human services for over 23 years now, and specifically in maternal and child health for about 17 years. And one of the things I do in my current role is I work with youth, sometimes I go into the schools, middle and high schools, to teach like life planning lessons to them. I also go into youth organizations and do the same thing, and that allows me to kind of see and hear firsthand what our teens are worried about, what they're concerned about, what stresses them out, because these lessons involve a lot of group discussion. And then also just being the parent of a teenager, I also see firsthand what my son and a lot of his peers struggle with on a day-to-day basis. So it's just become one of my passions and missions to help teens get on a path to health, good health, physically and mentally, and socially as well. So this is just one of my favorite things to do.
Great, yeah, well, and it sounds like with all your work and all the conversations and interactions you have with teens, you probably have a lot more inside information than the average parent of teens, but it's great that you're also able to combine your personal experience too, because you're also currently parenting a teenager. So, so I can't wait to learn from you today. And I can't tell you personally, I have two sons, and they're 12 and 9, and the closer my children have gotten to being teenagers, I have definitely heard a lot of people just say, oh, well, good luck, or wait till they're teenagers and they'll stop talking with you. So just to kind of get us started, is that true? Do teenagers just totally stop talking to their parents?
That certainly doesn't have to be true. A lot of it depends on the foundation you lay in the earlier years leading up to the teen years. But parents need to know that we still have the most influence over our children, even in the teen years. And but it is a time when teens are really wanting to exert their independence. And we know that parental involvement in school and in helping our kids with homework drops off a good deal when they hit middle school, and then even more so when they hit high school. And then, you know, our kids are getting their driver's licenses, and they're wanting to be off on their own with their friends and doing their own thing, and they may in fact act like they don't need us, but they still need us to be involved, and some would argue that they need us to be more involved in their teen years, when they're getting ready to enter adulthood and be out on their own. It's a time when they really need our guidance more than ever. So it's really important to keep the lines of communication open with your teens.
So why do you think then so many people assume, even parents do assume, that their teenagers don't need them or don't want to talk with them?
Well, I think they, usually in the high school years especially, they're pretty self-sufficient, and sometimes all you'll get is a grunt or a mm-hmm or a head nod. I've just kind of learned in talking to my son to, and I learned this with my job as well, but ask open-ended questions. Don't ask those yes-no questions. And a lot of times you'll get a fuller answer. And the other thing, though, that I see is that sometimes when you're ready to talk to your teen or you want to talk to them, they may not be ready to talk at that moment. And so, a lot of times, I know with my son, I'll say, is there anything you want to talk about? Because maybe I'll notice that he's acting a little off, and I'll get that, no, I'm fine. And then inevitably, about an hour later, he'll come down, to where I am and say, I really want to talk about such and such. And so, they may put on this facade that it's uncool to talk to their parents, or like I said, act like they don't need us, but the fact of the matter is they really do.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like one of the mistakes that parents might make is trying to push their children to talk with them before they're ready or when it's not good timing for them. So can you think of some other reasons why teens might be uncomfortable talking with their parents, in addition to that it's not the right time for them or they're just not in the right mood for it?
Yeah, well, in working with the youth in the schools and the youth organizations, and also in doing focus groups with teens, a lot of what I hear from them is that they don't think that their parents can relate to the things they deal with on a day-to-day basis, or they feel like their parents might be clueless, that type of thing. But one of the things I continue to hear is that the teens often feel like their parents talk to them as if they never made a mistake or a wrong decision or a bad choice when they were teenagers. And that sort of puts your teen on the defense, and that can make them shut down and not want to talk because they may feel judged by that. So
is it healthy as a parent to share some of your maybe mistakes or some behaviors that you engaged in as a teenager? I think a lot of parents are maybe afraid if they say, well, I did this or I wasn't perfect, that it might communicate to the teenager that it's okay for them to do the things that they did. But it sounds like you're kind of saying it's a good thing for parents to be open about some of the challenges they've had in their own lives.
Yeah, definitely to a certain extent it is. I mean, I wouldn't overshare, but
with some limits.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, sharing with your teen, if when you were a teenager, were you in a situation where maybe you were being bullied or harassed, and how did you deal with that, and how did you cope with how that made you feel? And what did you learn from that situation? Or, even getting too serious too quickly with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Were you in that situation, and how did you handle that? And, coping with the anxiety and depression that a lot of our teens are. If you can talk to them about some of your own experiences, you become more relatable and approachable for them. So it's like I said, it's not necessary to overshare, but I think the most important thing if you're going to share is to make sure you share how you handled it and how you coped with it and what you learned from it.
Yeah, that's great. And I think when teenagers do not feel that their parents are relatable or not approachable, then they have to talk about their experiences and their feelings with somebody. So parents might find that their teenagers are going to talk to other people, and so who are some of the other people that teenagers might turn to if their parents are maybe not available or not approachable or relatable, if they don't feel comfortable?
Well, first of all, a lot of teens today are, getting their information from their friends or from the internet or social media, and what we have to caution with that is that they may not be getting accurate or factual information, or they may be getting misleading information, and as parents we need to make sure that our kids are getting factual information either from us or their healthcare provider or another professional. And the other part to that question, though, is don't underestimate the power and the benefit of your child having another adult mentor in their life. We know that kids who have a committed relationship with a stable, trusted, caring adult who genuinely has their best interests at heart, these kids do really well in life. They tend to stay on the path to achieving their goals, and they become more productive and successful. So I tell parents often, yes, ideally you want your child to be talking to you about how they're feeling or what they're experiencing, but don't be offended if their go-to person is not you, because it could be a teacher, a coach, a counselor, a minister. It could even be the school resource officer. And the other good thing about having that adult mentor is that when they're talking to a responsible adult as opposed to just their peers, that adult would typically be more likely to encourage them to open up to their parent and have this dialogue with their parent. And a mentor can be a very good thing. And like I said, the research all shows that teens who do have that usually do better in life. So
yeah, so it sounds like the ideal situation would be for a parent to have an open line of communication with their teenager, and then for there also to be one or more additional trusted, credible adult mentors who have a positive influence on their life. And then the worst case scenario is probably when they don't have either an open relationship with the parent or a mentor, and then they're only getting their information online, or they're only getting their information from their peers. So it sounds like it would be a really positive thing to encourage, for parents to encourage the teenagers not only to have open communication with them, but to build those kind of mentoring relationships as well.
And one thing I want to say too is also when they do have a mentor in their life, respect the confidentiality they may have created with that mentor. I know that was tough for me at first, but I quickly learned that I needed to respect that my son did have another adult that he went to that he felt safe and comfortable with to share things, and I had to respect that confidentiality that they had between them.
Yeah, and let them have some space to have the interactions that don't involve you.
Right.
Yeah. Looks like we have a question that's come in.
We do. What if my teen is confiding or trusting someone that I don't feel comfortable with or that I don't trust myself?
Would this be a peer or another adult?
In this case, it would be an adult, maybe like an older family member or an older cousin or something like that.
Well, first of all, I would reiterate to my child that it needs to be a responsible adult who is stable, who really can give them good advice and won't lead them in the wrong direction. But the other thing that I would probably do if I were in that situation was talk to that person myself and, say that I'm glad my child has a relationship with you, but I would appreciate it if you would not give him certain advice or, and encourage him to come back to me, that's probably how I would handle that situation.
Yeah, that can always be tricky because, of course, a lot of teenagers tend to be a little bit rebellious, and so sometimes I think if you come down a little bit too hard in that situation, it might drive the teenager away or, again, make them further feel like they don't understand you. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense around just sort of talking with, and also talking with them about helping them to think through finding positive people, and let's look at the characteristics of this person and express your concerns and, get them to think as critically as possible about that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so that can be a definite tricky conversation to have. So let's talk a little bit about then how do parents set the stage for having positive communication with their teenagers. So assuming most parents do want to have good communication throughout the teen years, a lot of them probably don't know exactly how to make that happen. But what are some things that parents can do to set the stage for having an open line of communication with their teenagers?
Well, one of the first things is that parents can create a safe physical and emotional environment that encourages your child to be able to identify their emotions and express their emotions and learn to manage their emotions and their feelings. And part of that is listening patiently and not pouring on too much advice or being judgmental. But letting them know, it's real important to let your kids know that you've got their back, that you're their number one fan and you're their safe place to fall, and but then also being open to giving them the opportunity to talk with a professional counselor or therapist if the situation calls for that, or if you kind of feel like what your child might be dealing with is a little outside of your realm of knowing, how to handle it. But the main thing is that when kids feel heard and understood and validated, especially by their parents, it helps them build resiliency skills and coping skills. So that's important to know, and that's a good way to start setting the stage for open dialogue with your child.
And I think a lot of times, especially with teenagers, if they're not as verbal and not as talkative maybe as they were when they were younger, I think one of the mistakes that parents can make is they're only talking to them or they're only interacting with them when they're upset about something or they're doing something wrong. So I really like how you talked about the importance of just making sure that they're really know that you are their fan and making every effort to give that positive reinforcement. We talk a lot about that with like teenagers and really young children, or I mean with toddlers and really young children, just the importance of positive reinforcement. But it remains true even for teenagers.
Exactly.
And it might be harder, I think, if you have a difficult relationship with your teenager to find a lot of opportunities to give that, but just sort of general things that you can say, like that you're here for you, they're such a good person, they have a good heart, you're proud of them. Even if it's like simple things like, I'm proud of you that you pick your shoes up off the floor, and I know a lot of other kids don't do that, just trying to find little things to focus on and then building on that. But it's no wonder a lot of teenagers probably shut their parents out if they feel like all they hear is negativity.
Right. It's kind of, I think they say don't always catch your kid doing something bad, catch them doing something good, right, and then, praise them for it.
Yeah. And we learn to do that with a lot younger children, but then we kind of forget that a little bit more as they get older, that that's still a really important role for parents.
Right.
So what about more sensitive issues? So we know teenagers today, they just face a lot of different challenges, whether it's mental health challenges, sexual relationships, dating, bullying, drugs, and alcohol. So obviously we could probably do a whole program on how to talk about each of those issues specifically with a teenager, but just to kind of start us off really broadly, what suggestions do you have for how do you talk about these sensitive issues, especially when it's so hard to even just sometimes just talk in general with teenagers for parents?
Well, first of all, make sure you are having the conversation in a calm time, not when either of you is upset about something or anxious about something. But if, in a broad sense, if you're trying to have these conversations about sensitive topics for the first time, or if you're trying to broach these topics, first, with regard to sex and dating, I would make sure to teach them about setting personal boundaries and about consent in a sexual relationship, and making sure that they understand what that is. And in our state, our law says that consent means that the person has to give an affirmative yes, not just say no. They have to give an affirmative yes without being under the influence of any substances. And males and females need to know that. Both of them need to know that. And, you know, make sure that they understand that no one has the right to touch them without their permission or to disrespect them or their body. And then also, even if they're not having sex yet, it's still important to talk to them about what safer sex looks like, and the fact that condoms are needed to prevent sexually transmitted infections, and other forms of contraception may be needed to prevent an unwanted pregnancy. Because that's not just information they can use in the here and now, that's information they can use later on in life that they need to know about. And
it may, just to interrupt really quickly, it may also be a friend of theirs, it might not be them personally,
right.
But we know teenagers talk a lot amongst themselves too, and so it might be that they get some information that could help one of their friends too.
Exactly.
And just also too, I think on that consent piece, that really speaks to the importance for parents really needing to educate themselves about some of these topics, because that wasn't something that parents of teenagers today really heard a lot. That wasn't a word that was really talked about back in those days, and so, or a concept that was talked about in the way that it is now. And so for parents, we need to educate ourselves on these issues to be able to talk with our teenagers.
You know, and it's interesting because the way that conversation came up with my son and I was actually, we were watching an episode of Law and Order SVU, and the storyline was about two teenagers who engaged in sex, and the female felt violated and brought charges up against the boy. And so the whole episode was kind of talking about and debating this whole consent law, that it has to be an affirmative yes and without being under the influence. And my son was watching it with me, and I just, you know, started talking to him about this, and I was like, were you aware of this? And, you know, how do you feel about that? What do you think about what happened to the boy in this storyline? And, you know, so it did open up a dialogue for us, and now he understands fully what consent means.
Yeah, and that sounds like something that a lot of parents don't realize, that is actually a really great way to open conversations with teenagers, because they're so media-driven and social media-driven that they offer a lot of really good opportunities that parents might not necessarily just on their own think like, oh boy, that's a great opportunity to talk about something like this. And I think what a lot of parents do in those situations, they sit there really uncomfortably, maybe hoping their teenagers don't ask them anything about it, because they're not sure how they would answer those questions. So, so yeah, that's just a great example, a great story.
Yeah, and even, you know, stories in the news can be used as teachable moments for your children. The one thing that I would caution about, though, is that when it comes to overexposure to news stories that have to do with, say, school shootings or terrorist attacks, or even with my son, hearing news stories about fatal car crashes that involve teenagers makes him very, very anxious. But kids with overexposure to that kind of thing kids can actually get secondary trauma where they start to feel a lot of fear and anxiety and can even sometimes develop phobias. So while these things in good moderation can be great teachable moments, you just have to be careful about overexposure.
And being sensitive to what impact some of those situations and topics are having on them. So it looks like we have another question.
We do. This one comes from the audience. I'm divorced and my ex and I don't see eye to eye about teens and especially sex. He's more liberal, whereas I tend to be more conservative about the topic. How do I work through this with my teen as the primary caregiver and also the person who holds sole custody?
Well, first of all, I would, have that conversation with your child and, let them know what your values and beliefs are, but don't be too judgmental if, say, they by chance have already engaged in that activity, because that may shut them down from talking to you. But yes, tell them what your beliefs and your morals or your values are, and you can explain to them why you think it's important for them to wait till marriage for something like that. And one of the things you can talk about is that, we know with our teens, they often feel physically ready for sex long before they're really emotionally ready for sex, and all that can come with, losing your virginity or having sex for the first time. And so I think that's one thing you can talk about as well, that there is a big difference between being physically ready and emotionally ready. And with my son, talked about, I went to the extent of saying, your first time, whether it's great or it's horrible or traumatic, is something you are going to remember for the rest of your life. So, be sure that you are ready in every way that you need to be ready, that you're with a partner, a committed partner that you trust wholeheartedly, and that loves you. So those types of things are a good way to address that, and you can you can give them all that good information, and hope that your child is listening to you and not to the outsiders. But like I said, we still have the most influence on our children. So.
And I think also, just to touch on the other piece of that question, which was around the parents, the co-parenting parents, I guess, I think, that is a really complicated issue in terms of dealing with co-parenting, especially if parents aren't on the same page. We did address that in a previous Relationship Booster, which the website, you can find that through our e-learning center on teamwork in parenting and how to kind of manage difficult dynamics with co-parenting relationships or different people who are involved in co-parenting. But what I would say too, to kind of really just build that into what you said, is talk about those differences with your teenager, and sort of talk with them about the different opinions and the different ways and the different belief systems, and help them understand, like you said, why you believe the way that you believe and how you came to believe that, and that they have exposure to different opinions with their other parent. But as much as possible to help them to kind of try to think through that. And then, like you had said earlier in relation to the mentor, that if possible, if there's at least enough of a relationship with the co-parent or the other parent, to try to address it directly with them and see if you can at least get on the same page about how you're going to be handling it. But again, that does get into a lot of other issues around sort of the co-parenting and the divorced parents issues that we do have other resources available through the Healthy Relationships Initiative.
Right, good. And another thing and this is something I do when as part of the lesson when I go into schools, but I think it could be valuable for parents too. One of the things I do with the kids is I have them first write out their goals for their education, their career, what do they want out of marriage and family, you know, do they want to travel, things like that. Do they want to own a home, own a car? And, you know, and then after they list out all their goals, and they do it on a timeline, so, you know, they kind of have in their mind by when they want to achieve some of these things. And then I kind of back up and talk about, you know, so what is something, are you making the choices now that will keep you on track to achieving those goals? Because, you know, unintended pregnancy or pregnancy when you're not ready for it can kind of put a kink sometimes in some of those plans, or at least delay them.
Right.
You know, so that's another way that you can go about it as a parent is have them do some goal setting. So.
And I think that's a really great point, even going back to the bigger picture topic that we were talking about with how do you talk about some of these more sensitive issues. And I think that a great way to think about it is putting it into the long-term scope too. So it's not just the immediate, like the rule, like don't do this, don't do that, but to help them see how what you're trying to teach them about these issues really connects to the bigger picture of their lives. And so just helping them to take that big picture, because it might be hard for them to see how, oh, a choice that I'm making when I'm 15, 16, it's no big deal, it's just for today. But as parents, you can help them to kind of see that bigger picture and that bigger meaning.
Right, exactly.
Did you have any other, did you want to address any of the other specific sensitive topics, or did that touch on most of what we were?
Well, again, with regard, and again, this is if you're just trying to broach the subject for the first time and open that dialogue, but with regard to alcohol or drugs or even mental health issues, if you have a family history of that, that's one way to broach the subject, to talk to them, you know, and say, you know, there's a family history in our family of substance abuse or with depression and anxiety or mental health issues, and you need to be aware of that because it could make you more susceptible to those things. So, you know, just be aware and make smart decisions. And if you find yourself especially feeling very depressed or anxious, make sure you're talking to me about it or talking to somebody about it. And, you know, one thing about the mental health issues, the depression and anxiety, those rates are hitting staggering levels among our teens. And, you know, we know that now 1 in 4 teens between the age of 12 and 17 is experiencing a mental health issue like depression or anxiety. And we also know that the suicide rate among that age group has gone up 70% just in the last 10 years. And so I know that, you know, that is definitely a sensitive topic to talk to about your child, to talk to with your child, depression and anxiety and even suicide. But one thing that I want to really reiterate is that talking to your child about suicide is not going to put that idea in their head if they weren't thinking about it in the first place. But that conversation does need to be had, because we know from surveys that having suicidal thoughts is the #1 thing that kids are lying to their parents about or keeping from their parents. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty significant when you also know that the next thing that kids say that they're keeping from their parents or lying to their parents about is sex, mm-hmm. and that's 19%. So it's a distant second. Mm-hmm. And then 16% report lying to their parents about drugs or alcohol. So, and further, in these teen surveys by the CDC and by the Pew Research Institute, 70% of teens also say that depression and anxiety is a major problem among them and their peers. So this is something we really have to be paying attention to. and looking for red flags or signs in our kids, and making sure that, you know, we're talking to them about what they're feeling, because obviously there are a lot of kids feeling this pressure,
right.
you know.
And so if as a parent you do, so a lot of what we've been talking about so far today has really been more generally, you know, setting the stage for good communications and barriers to positive communication. But if you as a parent have some real concerns about whether it's anxiety, depression, if your child might be suicidal, if you're seeing some red flags, or even if you suspect they might be engaging in some risky behavior, how do you, I would assume a lot of times in those cases that the teenager is probably not very open with their parent, so we probably at that point, not all the time, but I'm sure a lot of times we do have situations where we have parents who really don't have a lot of good rapport maybe with their parents, or there's not a real ongoing dialogue. So how as a parent can you open that dialogue? It sounds like you're saying that we should just, as a parent, just come right out and say, I want you to know that I'm concerned about, you know, A, B, or C. You've also said about not having those conversations in the heat of the moment. It's not something you want to raise when there's a lot of conflict, but so setting the stage for a really positive conversation, addressing it directly. What other suggestions do you have for how parents can address very sensitive issues like that?
Well, one thing, first of all, is that parents need to be cognizant of recognizing the signs. Depression and anxiety can actually come as a result of these other sensitive issues that we're talking about, like being in an unhealthy relationship, or being bullied, or you know, drugs and alcohol and depression and anxiety are very closely tied, because we know kids as young as adolescents are turning to those things to self-soothe and help cope with the depression and anxiety that they might feel. But if you as a parent, if you're seeing you know, major changes in your kids, if they are starting to isolate and withdraw from family and friends, if their grades are dropping, if there's a significant change in their sleep or eating habits, if they seem just to have a flat affect and just seem hopeless, or on the flip side of that, if they're having a lot of mood swings or emotional outbursts, those can be red flags that something is going on with your child. And the way you should always approach it from a place of concern and not accusation. And one of the things that mental health experts suggest is, you know, instead of saying, what is wrong with you, you know, like we're often tempted to do, say, what happened to you? And in the sense that, what happened to you today or last week or in the past year that has made you feel so sad or so anxious or so angry, whatever, you know, the case may be, and how can I help you talk through that and work through that? And, you know, and even another thing, because you do still want your children to respect you, so if you have a child who is very angry a lot and has a lot of angry outbursts, often the best thing to do, if they start, you know, if you're trying to talk to them and they start kind of coming at you very angrily, you know, that's a good time to just say, I can see that you are really, really angry, and it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to direct all that at me. So I'm going to step away, and, you know, maybe you could take a breather, and then we'll come back and talk when the situation is more calm. You know, things like that. But also, the thing that we need to remember as parents is that their brains are developing up until they are 26 years old. And the frontal lobe, which controls, you know, critical thinking and sound judgment, and it helps them control impulsivity. That is one of the later things to develop. And so a lot of times kids really don't have the full capacity yet to think critically and have sound judgment and, control their own impulses. And especially when they're anxious, they operate more in their amygdala, and the amygdala is responsible for, controls emotions and fear and memory. And so, one of the things I tell parents a lot is that when their child is anxious and they're operating in the emotional part of their brain, sometimes the signals aren't getting through to their frontal lobe and their critical thinking part of the brain. And one thing that really helps with that is distraction. So we know that, especially with boys, it is very hard to make eye contact. It's hard for them to make eye contact when they're talking about, tricky subjects or sensitive issues. And so it just makes them feel very uncomfortable. And so it is really good when you're talking to kids to allow them to have something like a fidget spinner or a stress ball or a Rubik's Cube. Things like that they can fidget with, because what that does is it distracts them just enough that they're getting out of their emotional brain and into their thinking brain, that they can be more open to and receptive to the dialogue. And it's interesting because if you go into just about any therapist's office who works with kids, you will see tons of things like that people can pick up and fidget with. And I know I used to be one of those parents who, when I was talking, to my son, I'd be like, "You look at me when I'm talking to you." Look me in the eye, and then I learned this through a professional training that, sometimes, of course you can tell your kids, turn off the phone, turn off the TV or the video game. I mean, that's different from having just something to fidget with in their hands. Right. And so a little distraction can be good when you're having a conversation with your children too.
I just think understanding those developmental issues and the brain development is so important, because especially as teenagers get older, they look kind of like adults. They're kind of like a little bit smaller, younger looking adults. And so I think that it's tempting for a lot of parents to really feel like their teenager should be getting it or should be thinking about this more like an adult, and why do they keep making these choices? But to really understand that they're not dealing with a toddler anymore, but they're also not dealing with an adult, and so there has to be some sort of adjusting of those expectations and understanding that they may not be able to reason as fully as if they were talking with an adult. Right,
exactly. And the other thing with regard to that brain development that I want to make sure parents know is that that's another thing. If you are talking to your child about, say, drugs and alcohol, it's important for them to know too that because their brain is not fully developed, they can become addicted so much quicker and on less amounts of a drug or alcohol or cigarettes, if that may be. They can become addicted so much faster than an adult because their brain is not fully developed. And also related to that, they can do a lot more damage to the normal development of their brain in using those substances as a teenager or as an adolescent. So, when you're talking to your children about those things, reiterate the health risks, and even though it is difficult for kids to think long-term or, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, still give them that information that to tell them that the choices they make, the health choices and the health behaviors that they engage in today is really going to impact their health mentally and physically down the road, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So, just advising them of those things is really helpful too.
Yeah. I think we had another question that came in.
We do. How can I discuss safety on social media and balancing online behavior with my teen without seeming old-fashioned or outdated?
Well, that's a good one. And I'm glad that somebody asked that, because research is also showing that there is a correlation between the huge increase in rates of depression and anxiety among teens and the bursting onto the scene of social media. And there's a lot of reasons why social media can contribute to depression and anxiety in our kids. And for example, when I was a teenager and there was no such thing as cell phones or computers actually at that time, if I was being harassed at school or, something like that, when I left school and went home, I didn't have to deal with it again till the next day. But with social media, bullying can be 24/7 and follow our kids home. The other thing is, if there is a lot captured on our phones now, every embarrassing moment or mistake we made can become part of social media. And again, that's an issue that I did not have to deal with as a teenager, but our kids have to deal with that, and that can make them feel very anxious. The other thing is that it's really important to explain to our kids that, they need to take a break for their own mental health from social media every now and then, because I think even adults get into this fear of missing out mode, and you're constantly checking Facebook, Instagram, especially our kids, and all their other platforms they're on, and it can be really hard if, for them, if they're seeing their friends hanging out together and maybe they weren't invited or they didn't know about a gathering, or they've had a breakup and they see their boyfriend or their girlfriend with somebody else. Everything is just so in their face right now because of social media. And so, a couple of things that I would really make sure to talk to your child about is that, first of all, take a break from it. I know a lot of parents that after dinner, the phones go in a, a safe. They actually put them in the safe, the parents and the adults, and they do not get them out till the next morning. And, and there's also obviously a lot of controls that you can put into place on their phones or on their laptops. And then also talk to them to make sure they really understand that once something is online, it is there forever. And, talk to them, again, trying to help them look a little, into the future. We know that employers now, when they're interviewing people, they look at their Facebook pages or their Instagram pages. And so, helping kids keep in mind that what's put out there today will be out there for forever and really could have an impact on parts of their life down the road is important.
And I think, too, all of that really speaks to also, I think the comment about how to not seem ancient and, really out of touch, I think really speaks to the heart of this whole topic, because as a parent of a teenager, you're kind of walking this fine line between wanting to be there for your teenager and be somebody that they can talk to, and then also still being in a disciplinary role. And so I think one thing I would sort of add, I think, in addition to what you said about the social media, is just educating yourself about it so that you understand it. And I think that same thing is true for a lot of the issues that teens deal with today, that as parents, it's an important part of the responsibility in getting your teen to talk to you to know what's going on at their school and what kind of social pressures they're facing today, what kind of drugs people are using in their schools, what kind of music that they're listening to, how social media is influencing their lives. And there is a lot about, for parents of teenagers, when they were teenagers, a lot of similar experiences are still happening. Like you said, you would have felt left out at times, or you could have experienced harassment or bullying or peer pressure or different things. But the world has changed too, and so I think for parents today, I think just really educating themselves and learning more so that you're not going to seem as out of touch if you're not as out of touch. But maybe, because we're coming to the last few minutes of our program, and so maybe just the last piece to talk about is sort of how, as a parent, do you really balance that? I want to sort of be a friend, I want to be someone you can come to as your parent, but I'm also here, I have to set some limits on you, and I have authority over you. And so just what are your thoughts as parents, and just maybe even some just kind of final tips to give parents about how to play both roles and balance both roles, especially in times when there's a conflict between them.
Right, and that is a hard line to balance. And excuse me. And I really don't think that one role is more important than the other. I think they're equally important, because you do want your child to be talking to you and feel comfortable coming to you when they need help or need advice. And if you solely parent out of fear, a lot of times they're not going to come to you. They're going to be too afraid of the consequences. And so I think on one hand, like I said before, you need to be their safe place to fall and make sure you know that, or that they know that you're in their corner and you're there to help them and guide them. But on the other hand, yes, of course, we want to be respected as parents. And, like I gave that example where if your child is, confronting you angrily, yes, you can say, this is not acceptable, I will not take your verbal abuse, and you can set some boundaries. And I think one of the ways that kids will be more receptive to those boundaries is, to help them understand that a lot of the boundaries you're setting aren't necessarily punitive. It really is for their own good, and of course they'll say, you don't know what's best for me, and they'll give you all of these arguments, and they often forget that we were teenagers, at one point. But just again, coming from an angle of, this is something that's going to be good for you, even if you can't see it right now. Can you just trust me? And you can still demand respect or insist on them being respectful towards you and obeying your boundaries. And so I definitely think both are equally important.
It sounds like it's kind of, for the most part, you want to be sort of balancing them both equally, but then there might be a time when one side, you need to step up and be a little bit more friend in a moment, like if your teenager has an experience of being left out or being hurt or something bad happened, then maybe not as much of the punitive kind of side. Or, like you said, if they really cross the line, they need to know that there is that side, the disciplinarian side too, but for the most part, to try to keep them pretty equally balanced. And then there might be times when one would weigh more heavily, but then to kind of get that back. So before we wrap up today, what's one kind of big picture sort of takeaway that you hope people will leave today's program with?
Well, I think, you know, one broad concept that I hope people leave today with is that, you know, I do hear, just like you said, you hear a lot that when your kids get to be teens, they'll stop talking to you. I hear a lot from parents, our kids are the most entitled generation that's ever been. You know, what do they have to be so stressed out about? And, you know, yes, it is true that our kids do enjoy some conveniences and things that we did not have when we were their age, but that does not negate the fact that our kids are also dealing with major stressors in their lives that we did not have to deal with. And we really got to be paying attention to our kids, and like you said, educating ourselves around what is going on in their lives, in their school, you know, in their sports team, whatever it may be, and, you know, recognizing, don't be too quick to dismiss, you know, mood swings or angry outbursts as typical teenage behavior, you know, or hormones. A lot of times you really need to delve a little bit further because it could be a warning sign that something is going on that needs your attention and that you need to address with your child.
So really setting that stage for ongoing communication and then being prepared when there's maybe a red flag raised to really step in and have those more difficult conversations when they're needed.
Yeah, and you know, another thing too is that a lot of parents become fearful of the talk.
Right.
And what I tell parents a lot is that there doesn't have to be just one talk, you know, one big talk. It can be little talks as the opportunities present themselves or as those teachable moments present themselves. So, you know, don't get all stressed out or caught up in, oh, I've got to have this one big talk that covers everything that can possibly happen.
You say exactly the right words at exactly the right moment and everything. Well, I just want to thank you for all that you've shared. I think that I've learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that those of you who've been part of this program have too. So I'll also add that through the Healthy Relationships Initiative, we know that parenting teenagers there's not as many resources, I think, compared to parenting at other ages. So we have worked to develop some resources through the Healthy Relationships Initiative, and if anybody's interested in looking at those, I would encourage you to go to our website at guilfordhri.org, click on How Can HRI Help You Today, and then you'll see the category for teenagers and go there, and that would be the easiest way to access all of those resources. So before you sign off today, I hope that you will take a moment to fill out our feedback form, and Camilla posted the link for that in the chat room, so please take a moment to do that before you sign off. But we certainly hope that what we talked about today helps you to have healthier relationships in your own lives. And the next Relationship Booster will be on Friday, May 3rd at noon, and the topic will be self-care for busy parents. And you can click the link there or go visit that website if you'd like to register for that one. So thank you again, Brenda, for being here, and all of you for being here, and we'll see you next time.